So thank you to everyone that's joined so far. My name's Charlotte and I'm the PINS Project Officer working across Cheshire and Merseyside. And just to confirm, this session is being recorded. Today is the 5th training session on teacher language, which is being led by Rachel today. Just some basic house rules to make sure your microphones are turned off so there's no background noise. And if you have questions, myself and Helen will be monitoring the chat, but as Rachel's just said, there will be time at the end as well. So the recording of this session and any of the materials shared are available on the Futures platform. So if you've got any problems accessing it, please let me or Helen know. And Helen has already put a message in the chat just to say if you can put your name and the school that you're attending from, it just helps us with the attendance log because it's not always clear on the attendance list from Microsoft Teams who is linking in from where. So thank you for that, Helen. I don't think there's much else to say, so I will pass over to Rachel and you can introduce yourself and your slides.
Thanks. Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for that. That's really helpful to see who's here, and you can use the chat for that. I won't be able to see the chat, so Charlotte's kindly going to keep an eye on that. So it was my colleague Ben Large presented the same presentation yesterday. So we've devised this together between ourselves. So we've called it Raising Awareness of Language Differences for Neurodivergent Pupils in School, which is quite a mouthful. Okay, so we were due to start at past, so we'll just get going. And if people join, if you don't mind, just admitting as we go. Yes, so as I said, my name's Rachel Allen. You may have met Ben Large. His role is NHS specialist speech and language therapist. I'm also a specialist speech and language therapist, and I work across the NHS and the autism service teams. So we've worked together on this one. So lots of you will be familiar with Teams already. That's just a bit of an introduction. You can add questions to the chat if you'd like to. In between, if you don't mind staying on mute, just in case there's any interference. So we've just given some aims for today here. So thinking about increasing school staff awareness of some of the differences in language skills related to social communication, and covering some practical strategies for supporting children with language and social communication challenges in a mainstream setting. So we want it to fit in with the whole project, and it's obviously a really wide audience, so just bear with. So it's more of an overview really. So there's lots of different more intensive training in each area. So we can't really do speech and language in an hour, but it's a bit of a whistle stop. So you have other training that you could access. So LCLAN, for example, the mainstream speech and language services where we're based offer training, primary and secondary training. And there's lots of new approaches and new therapies coming around, some of which I'll mention. Gestalt language is one of them. So you can also, if you have a student, with some of these needs, you can get some more in-depth training if you need to. So this is our language pyramid. So this is like a building block system or a wall. So if you look at the foundation at the bottom of the pyramid, these skills need to be secure before the skills above develop. So this is coming under some review because we are changing, like with everything. We're reviewing all our literature and our research and the way we work with children, all our therapies. So it's not an exact science, it's not linear, and it's not as liked now. We've introduced other approaches such as Gestalt language processing, where the child might not acquire language in a typical order. So this pyramid wouldn't make sense for them because they don't work that way. They learn a great big chunk rather than a one word first. So what we tend to do, so you might see targets around play. So you see play here at the bottom of the pyramid. So especially for your younger students and younger children. So by developing the interaction and play skills, we can help them learn about the world around them, take an interest in others. And then we think about things like eye contact, gesture, facial expression, as well as turn taking and sharing within that. So by supporting the development of the social interaction skills, we can then hope to develop attention and listening, and then understanding and ability to use language. But like I said, it doesn't always go in that exact order, but I still find it quite a useful pyramid just to show you. Yeah, so we've started to consider now the children that we don't acquire language in the typical way. So this is Gestalt language processing. So they learn language as chunks. So they might have a nursery rhyme or a song, but not many words otherwise, and they may appear much more able than they are. So that's worth mentioning to you because there's a lot of change around that. So we've done a little quiz here. So let's have a look. If I'm just looking away, I'm just looking at my other laptop as well. So there are, you can use the chat if you want to have a guess. There are approximately how many school-age children with an autism diagnosis in England, it says. Could be, yeah, it should seem to be focused on it. Have a guess. Is anything coming up in the chat? So we had a look at the latest figures are from the NAS, the National Autistic Society. They're quoting 166,000. This has gone up over the last few years. What percentage of these students do we think are enrolled in mainstream schools? Any guesses? It's a hard time of day, isn't it? Good job I'm not doing breakout rooms today.
Do you want do you want replies in the chat box?
If you want to. It's hard, isn't it, when everyone's just busy, aren't they, at this time in the afternoon? But I can give you the answer if you like. I'm not going to force you to participate. So yeah, so about 70% of these students are in mainstream schools, so it's really important. This means every teacher will have autistic students in the class throughout their career, and not including social communication differences without a diagnosis. And as we know, that's not an easy process, and it can be a long wait. So there are lots of children with differences that don't have a label as such. What percentage of communication would you say is verbal? I always use this one because I like this one. Okay. Really small. There's a few different studies on this.
Got Rebecca Emery is saying 20%. We've got 30%, quite low.
It's really low. So there's lots of studies on this, and then there was a really famous one that's really old that I prefer to quote because it says only 7% is verbal. So yeah, most researchers agree around 70%. So we'll talk about communication today. So thinking about what does communication mean, I think with this audience, I think you've got a really good idea. Yeah, so it involves both understanding and expression. So forms of expression may include personalized movements, so gestures, objects, vocalizations, verbalizations, signs, pictures, symbols, printed words, and output from what we call AAC, which stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication Systems, which could be paper or pictures or devices. And it also includes non-verbal communication as well as taking into account the meaning of other people's perspectives and intentions, which we'll talk about because that can be tricky. So what do we mean by language and communication? So this is quite a busy slide, so I'll just let you have a look at it. So as you can see, communication's got a lot of skills to it. As speech and language therapists, we tend to consider all these different areas of language. So today we'll be thinking about the skills more in the language section, because like I said, it's quite huge to break down really, but specifically focusing on the language. So understanding and using words and sentences, the understanding of concepts, processing of instructions, narrative skills, using words to describe objects, actions and attributes, creating sentences and following grammatical rules. So there's a lot there just even in the language section on its own. So lots of skills impact on each other. So for example, if you have difficulty seeing the big picture, you might have difficulty, sorry, my notes are going a bit weird. So if you have difficulty, the big picture, you might have difficulty with sequencing and the narrative skills, or even following the theme of a conversation. And if you have difficulty inferring from words, you might have difficulties then in reading comprehension or understanding ambiguous language. So literacy and language are very much linked together as well, as you'll be aware. So if you have difficulty understanding perspective of others, you'll find it hard to regulate relationships or match your own behaviour and display expected typical behaviours according to the needs of others. So social communication overall is a combination of the skills in all of these areas, and the use of them, one affects the other. So any social situation, any skills that are difficult in these areas, that all affect each other. So different situations, different people, different levels of formality, there's a lot to consider. So this isn't a definitive list, but these are just some common areas that we chose. So these are areas that we're thinking about speech and language in particular, what we would be assessing and looking at and working on. So these areas we'll look at a little bit more in detail today. So a key area we'll talk about is verbal reasoning. So it includes inference, sequencing and narrative. Non-literal language we'll cover, so including sarcasm, idioms and figurative language. And they may also have difficulty retrieving vocabulary. This is the same with students that have a language difference and also a language difference which relates to autism or a social communication need. So they might have difficulty organising longer discourse. So there's a lot of planning involved in saying a sentence and a lot of motor activity behind the scenes to be able to get at what you want to say. We've just put some more examples here, so I'll talk through those a little bit. So many children with social communication difference have a coexisting language disorder. So language disorder is quite a scary term, but there is, we do look at language disorder quite differently after a certain age. That there is quite often a language difference, even if it's not obvious, alongside autism is a very high percentage. There will be some differences into the way your student uses and understands language, even though it's not completely obvious. And they might not necessarily need intervention or speech and language therapy, but they just their language and the way they think and remember and use that information is different. And obviously every student's different, that goes without saying, but so it's different for each child. So AAC, I've touched on that. So that's assistive or aided communication. So we can use it for less verbal or children that can ask, but they can't actually use the words in a functional way. And it doesn't detract in any way from verbal if the student is able to verbalise. It's an additional support. And then we can have like what we call low technology aids. So things like communication boards and books. You might have seen some of those in your classroom. I know as therapists, we're really trying to promote the use of some of these things that have perhaps previously only been seen in specialist settings. We're finding it's very useful in the mainstream environment with our students' needs now. The start language processing is the GLP part there. So that's supporting the language supporting the children that learn the language in the chunks, so gestalt chunks, rather than in the natural pattern like the pyramid that I just showed you. So we use things like barrier games and keyword levels for language. So you might have heard therapists talking about, can you follow instructions at 2 keyword level? So what that would mean is, say, if you had a doll and a rabbit, and you said to the child, if it was a younger child or a child with additional needs, show me the doll's eyes and then show me the teddy's ears. So that's a choice of 2, and that's where you're up to. It's quite hard to understand, but I always use that as an example. So if your child's only at 1 or 2 keyword level and you talk to them in a average sentence, they won't be able to understand all that information. So that's worth bearing in mind. Vocabulary, so we do a lot of work around vocabulary. We'll talk about that a little bit. So we have topic vocabulary and vocabulary which links, and that links with the curriculum and literacy, of course. And then blank levels, we're going to talk about blank levels quite a bit, because we do tend to, you'll see, if you have speech and language in your settings, you'll see that set as a target because they're very functional. So we talk quite a lot about that. Yeah, so if you have children, you see, that these kind of needs, then you need to be referring in to speech and language therapy for some of this. So, yes, blank levels. Let me talk to you about blank. Some of you will have seen this already, but I always try to put it in most of my training because I find it really helpful. We have, I think Ben's arranged for activity packs to give you an overview if you haven't seen the blank levels of how to provide those kind of activities and examples. I think they can be emailed out. So this, if you've not seen it, it's the blank language for learning model. So it was devised, it's quite old now, it was devised in 1978. So it encourages the development of verbal reasoning and abstract language. Can you see the slide okay? Because it's quite small for me. So I hope everyone can see it all right.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, if you want any more information on this, we are sending this out as well. So this is a really useful model because it breaks down this quite complex area of language into 4 achievable steps. So it's quite common for neurodivergent children and young people to find developing abstract language or verbal reasoning much more difficult. There's a lot of unspoken rules. So we're hoping to empower you to have a look at blank and have a go. And we've sent you some, we'll do some practical activities, and we've sent you some examples as well, because we think it's great. And as I said earlier, there is, more focused training around this as well, if you are interested in exploring it a little bit further. So these, the activities are separated up by levels. So we start at the lower level, so the level 1, and then we work upwards. And you will quite often do go into high schools as well and see students working at blank level 4. So you don't always expect that, but that is very much the case. So it's important when I do training around behaviour, and some of the training I did for the Autism Education Trust, we tend to kind of try and talk about the whole area of that. So what's behind that? So for example, your why questions, we use a lot of why questions. We use them around behaviour, and we get people to tell us what happened, and that can be really complex for some of our students. So you'll see these targets set if you've got a speech and language therapist involved quite often. It does fit in with the curriculum, and there's some really nice examples of questions as well that we quite often give out that fit into certain lessons. So for example, if you know your child's working at a blank level 3, you can pitch your questions in your science lesson towards that level. So I hope that's helpful there. So that's just another slide really saying the same thing, but just breaking it down a little bit more. Is anyone familiar with blank? Have you seen it before? or is it all brand new? I don't know where everyone's coming from, so it's hard to gauge. I'll just carry on.
I've heard of them, but I haven't known any more about it. But I'm a DCO.
Right, yeah, okay. Like I said, it's a wide audience, isn't it? So we just I'll give you the information. You can see what you think. We do use it. That's yeah, I can see that. I can see the chat today. That's good. Okay, good. So there's just a bit more of a breakdown. So you level 1, level 2, so quite a bit easier. Just label, show me, tell me. That's all level 1. Early semantic processing is level 2, and level 3 is moving towards narrative skills, so taking another person's viewpoint, inferencing, and starting to problem solve. So it does help to know what level your child's at. Like I said, because then you can adapt your language. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so a lot of activities that we set and teaching staff set in lesson, it can seem quite easy. So you could say, tell me about your best friend. That sounds like quite a simple task, but that might be really tricky and there's a lot of unknowns and it might just need breaking down further in order to get it to take away the ambiguity, take away any anxiety, be very clear, use your visual. So we talk about that. We'll talk about breaking things down. Yeah, so let's have a look. We did a little quiz, so we'll just move on and show you this. So you've got the idea now. So we're not going to do little groups because we haven't got lots of time today, so we won't do breakout or anything, but if I know you've started to use a chat already, so that's really good, and Charlotte's keeping an eye on that. So you're welcome to pop in the chat if you want to do a little quiz. Shall we just go through it? Shall we go through it in one? So let's have a look here. So look at these different types of questions. So what's this? What level would that be? So that is just easy because it's just show me, tell me. Yeah. I can't always see the chat, but I can today. Is the noise distracting that is coming up on the chat? Is it okay for everyone? Because it's just, I know Charlotte's keeping an eye anyway. So yes, 1, easy. Not for all students, but yeah. How about how do you know he's sad? Any guesses? Yeah, sounds quite easy, doesn't it?
Sorry, Rachel, do you want me to tell you what's in the chat or?
It's popping up, but it's popping up with noise. And it's
Oh, we
helping
can't
me.
hear the noise.
That's fine. That's what I wasn't sure of. It's helping me because I can see, and normally when you're presenting, you can't see the chat, but I'm lucky today. And I can see that you're thinking around 2s and 3s, am I right? When it was popping up there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it sounds quite easy, really. It sounds not as easy as what's this or show me this, but it sounds easy. How do you know he's sad? Because we use that kind of language every day with our students. But it's actually a level 4 question. Because it's quite difficult to work out. And how question is what we call higher level language. So anything that where you need to work out how and why, it's a bit more complex. So let's choose another one. How about which one shall I choose? What will the girl say to the boy? What do you think about that one? It's always more fun when you do this in groups, but do you think?
I'm answering these from a completely non-education background, by
That's
the way.
fine. It's good to guess. And now I've said about the difference between the first 2, it might help. Yeah. So you can tell it's a bit harder to think about that. So you're right to go up. Yeah, so that's 4. So this one, this one would be a level 3 questions. When you need to infer what someone's saying or thinking, that's all like a level 3 kind of skill. So we quite often set activities around that, and some of our neurodiverse children really struggle with that. It's a very complex thing to do, to work out what's in another person's head, especially if you find it hard to read face expressions and body language, which some students do. So that's at level 3. Should we just do one more? Could do show me another one like this. That's while you're pointing to something, by the way. Yeah. So I can see that yeah, you put in number 2, and that's right. So if I was pointing at the same time and making it much easier, it'd be more of a 1. But same and different concepts, you're moving up into level 2 territory. So that's good. And thanks for joining in, because it's not quite as much fun when I don't separate you off into groups, but it just helps you think about the different types of questions. So that's great. Thank you. Don't know if we had those on our original slides, but just thought it'd be helpful to just break it up with a little activity. So thinking about supporting the students to answer difficult questions. So help them notice important parts of the information. So our students might focus on specific parts, so they might miss the central theme, or they might have difficulty prioritizing the information. So you might need to help them find that. Giving extra time. So some children will need much more time to think about the question and what it means, and then organise the most appropriate answer. So you can repeat and rephrase your question and try and give thinking time first before adding additional language on. It might help to relate to familiar experiences. Some of our social understanding comes from our experience and our own experience of the world and the environment. For example, knowing what to do in a supermarket and that kind of thing. So that can help. What's happened in the past? How did they resolve it before? They might need your help to generalise with that kind of thing across different settings and situations. So using visual supports, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and using pictures, photographs and objects, and also supplying information to organise. Giving alternatives, so is it X or Y, or would you do X or Y next? So relating back to their personal experience again, that can help. And can they think of another example? So thinking about, I'll just keep talking, and then if anything anything comes up that we want to come back to, we can do that. Does that sound okay? Because I can't see everything, but I did manage to see some of that chat before.
Yeah.
So inferential thinking. So people don't always say what they mean. Definitely not. We just naturally speak in a certain way. There's lots of unspoken rules that many people know how to work out, and some don't, depending on whether they know are diverse or not. So this is linking to blank level 4. So working out what we mean, working out what someone might say is really difficult. Thinking about like literal interpretation of language. They might have a weakness with working memory, might find it difficult to make the links between the different parts of language. And if you have difficulty retaining and listening at the same time, that will affect your thinking and the language output as well. So they might focus on the specific details rather than the big picture. And they might have differences in the social cues and reading those. So might not be able to follow a perspective of another person as easily, and different experience of social interaction and making sense of other perspectives. And as I said before, the environment and their background knowledge and experiences also impacts. So thinking about visual, so making observations in a social context, and verbal, interpreting spoken language and written text, fiction and non-fiction. So when we're thinking about language at this level, might need to look for the hidden information. We might need to encourage our students to do that. And some children might not know that they need to look for this hidden information that we find. What information is there? What clues do we have? What does it tell us? What else do we know? Can we make a best guess? And it also helps, especially students that are very anxious, that it's okay to get it wrong, and it's all right not to be right every time, and that there's a lot more margin for error in some of these activities, and students that are anxious also find that to be a barrier. Social inferencing, so helping students make sensible guesses about what's happening in the situation, and creating opportunities to practice inferential thinking. So you can do like 20 questions and wordless books, and we have lots of different therapy approaches that we use to kind of help the student practice this in a one-to-one situation, with the hope that they can generalize some of that. But obviously we're moving away from kind of training to change. It's more if the child would like support in that area, you know, we can help look for those clues. It's not you're wrong because you can't see them. So we need to be careful how we look at it. There's a really good, I think we put a link at the end for the, I think we have. Yeah, I always, when I'm training, I always like to mention the double empathy theory. So we have linked to that, and I think it's quite useful to look at that and think about, you know, is the communication going wrong because of the neurotypical person or the typical person, and where the barrier is. If you're interested in that, go and read some more on that. But there's a lot of change around the way we offer therapy and those kind of approaches for this reason. So that's an area on its own, but we're trying to be succinct today. So I'll move on, looking at non-literal language. So non-literal language is anything that means something different to what we actually say, which is how we speak all the time. So it can take lots of different forms. So here are some examples. So students with social communication difficulties will often have difficulty interpreting and using social context. So what's appropriate for the situation, seeing the whole, thinking about the perspective of another, and the social cues, like I've talked about already. So the tone of voice and the body language, and the less skilled at decoding this. I think we naturally, if you're neurotypical, you naturally do this, and you have to do it, especially you know, for those students moving up to high school. I think the language becomes more complex, and the way that people speak, it is not always so clear. And in natural conversation as well, we wouldn't always be speaking in an easy to understand way for everybody. So we've just put some examples there. So language, and then we've got some examples of the language in the classroom. So being aware of what you say and other hidden meanings. Some of these sayings, you wonder where they came from, but we all understand them. But you know, that not everybody does. It depends how your brain works. So yeah, checking, understanding and clarifying and explaining helps. And as the students get older, encouraging them to monitor their own understanding. So we quite often do activities around that as well. So being able to, how do you ask if you're stuck, and what is it that you didn't understand about that? Was it the way that the person said it? Did they say it too fast, or is it just the words meant something totally different than what they said? So using non-literal language. So thinking about how to help. So being aware of when you use idioms, like I said, we just use it a lot in natural speech. Saying phrases which mean something different. When you do use them, explain. So do you know what that means, or they look confused? And put into context using real life examples. And then you can work on it in a fun way in the whole class if you do find that you have a student who encounters difficulties with language in that way. Raining cats and dogs on the board, that kind of thing. So thinking about visuals now, we always recommend visuals. So why would we use visual support? So autistic students quite often have strong visual skills. Visual support is consistent, it doesn't change. It's more permanent, so you can refer back to it. So it will help those with lower attention spans as well. And at times of anxiety, it'll really help to reduce. And they often depersonalize difficult requests. So if things are coming from the picture or the visual, it's not always quite as much demand, especially for a student who's slightly more avoidant of demand. The visual is saying this rather than the adult saying, you will do this, and it just feels less of a challenge for some of our young people. When a student's quite anxious or overloaded, they might not be able to process your request anyway. So it will just make it easier to process because spoken language can, processing that verbal information can go out of the window. For example, if they're heightened in a sensory way or quite dysregulated emotionally, all the verbal information will just go. So the visual can help with that. So I think this slide might be slightly differently to the one. I don't know if we sent the packs out yet, but just thinking overall in the language strategy examples. So we'll talk about just different ideas and different strategies. Some of them you will have seen already. So thinking about some of these really. So thinking about universal and targeted language, using unambiguous language, breaking down long sentences, chunking up longer information. You can chunk long information into 3 parts. That helps memory if you're quite typical, but it'll still be too long for some of our students. And depending on which level and which setting that you're working in, you would have to break it down again to their level, going back to, for perhaps level 1, as we were talking about before. So thinking about commenting rather than questioning, especially with very anxious students or younger children. Be covering a wide audience here, like I said, so it's the same across, but different rules for different areas. So I'll try and expand if you need me to at the end. So yeah, levels of understanding as well. So we just talked about that, and blank was a good way of breaking that down. So there's different levels and where they're up to. So all those kind of generalized strategies, what we tend to give for language. So visual supports, these can be used for daily routines and for days when we're expecting things to be different. So it can be quite simple or it could be more complex. So you've got your list and then you've got your picture, and it depends on your student as to which way which way it'll be set up and their level of understanding, but it's breaking down. This is a trip abroad. So that could be for school trip example. So across where we work, so across the autism service and with our speech and language across CCICP, we would always be recommending visuals, and most services will. We do promote the use of communication boards as well, as I mentioned before, because they're very useful. And you know, mainstream's not really mainstream anymore. We have a real mix, don't we, of ability and, you know, what people can understand. So it's great if we can bring in some of these additional methods. So we'd also use what we call a total communication approach. So we do always accept the use of gestures, written words, different ways of communicating, as well as the verbal way, because, well, like we said before, that's not the only way. Makaton as well, for even if you learn, you know, for example, you know, your students learn some Makaton in nursery, or you don't go on a baby sign app and teach yourself 2 words and just use those. Even that would be helpful. So it's just kind of thinking in that way, you know, what could you put in to support? So thinking about adapting your own communication, so say less, using shorter sentences, and here's some examples of some really long sentences, and we all do it. I do it at home as well. And like I said, as you move up to high school, the language becomes even more complex. And you can also help to break some of this down visually and use different methods, especially if you know that there is a difficulty with language. This kind of question won't be able to be followed verbally alone. So thinking about adapting communication again. So this is another moving slide. I'll just show you this. So there's different types of vocabulary. So if one of your students has a significant vocabulary difficulty, they might be able to work on the basics, so what we might call tier 1 words. But for the majority, tier 2 are likely to be the most useful words, so the descriptive words that cross over the curriculum. But you might not experience them every day. And then you've got tier 3 words, which might not be useful, and they're related to a specific context, and they need them for a certain topic. And then you'd have to teach those specifically. So we do quite a lot of work. So children with DLD, for example, developmental language disorder, we quite often teach a lot of strategies around vocab and accessing words visually and in other ways. And things like topic vocabulary are always really helpful. So if you know something's going to come up in your half-term teaching, bring that in prior if you can, and you do have the support available. So children with a strong specific interest may develop quite impressive vocabulary on their own topic. So it may be an area of special interest, but then they might need support to develop the vocabulary earlier on. So some of those more basic vocabulary words, so some of that everyday vocab, because they're quite used to talking about their thing and they've honed that, and the other bits can be missing. So thinking about the blank levels again and what level questions they're at. Strategies to adapt your communication. Making sure you have their attention. So thinking about the blank levels we talked about and where the level of questioning is for reasoning and problem solving. Be aware of how many questions, so it might be more useful, again, to use more of a visual approach, label and explain and use a picture. And we always say with early years, all the way up to high school students that are very anxious, we always suggest you reduce questioning. Everybody naturally questions, and it's natural to be inquisitive and say, what's this and how are you? But questions can be quite demanding. We always like people to comment more than we question, which is difficult when you're education staff, because we naturally want to do that, and it's how we want to get the student to learn that way. But it's just kind of thinking about rephrasing. So processing is another huge area on its own, but I've got a slide. So some students you'll find, you might have a processing difference and not have any other issue, but there's a real difference in the time you need to be able to process language. So you could ask the question and then you might take this long. So it might take that long to receive your response, and it can feel quite uncomfortable, that wait, but some students really need that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything else wrong. Some people just need a lot of time to process the information. Particularly younger children, we do have a lot of strategies around early language. We have a lot of acronyms to use, like say less, stress what you mean, show them. So use the visual, use the toy, and go slow. So we have a variety of different ways of saying just slow down and give them time to develop, to think about it and develop their response. So just briefly, just go over some strategies here. So there are lots of different approaches. So we only have an hour, so we can't talk about everything today. But there's useful programs to look at. So you've got social thinking, Michelle Garcia Winner, which is a framework for understanding impaired interactive perspective taking. That's for a range of students who are cognitively able and may have some insight. And as I said before, it's for students who want to maybe work on some of these difficulties. We wouldn't come along quite prescriptively and say you need to learn how to do that. We take a different approach. So thinking about social stories, you'll have seen some of these, but it's just some of the main ones. So social stories to give information and reassurance, but not to tell them what to do. So they have to be phrased in a certain way. So it's there is training around this, and it's a whole approach on its own. I think there is some misunderstanding around social stories, that it's to get them to discourage a behaviour or stop doing something, but it's not. It's when they work best when they're used to reduce anxiety and give a bit of clearness and concreteness to the situation that they might be in. So here's some more examples. So these are thinking about getting things right. So some students really keen not to ever get anything wrong. And then example here of boundaries of personal space. So these have to be written quite carefully. So we're not discouraging the behaviour, as I said. We're just offering information about what might happen and what you could do in that situation. And then we've got comic strip conversations. So you can do these in all different ways. Again, some of these approaches have their own training, but you will see them come up and they are useful. So revisiting what's happened, using drawing, that can really help with students that don't have the best language skills to be able to tell you and break it all down and figure out themselves what's happened in the situation or why they've become dysregulated. So talking it through, and the more you use their language, the better. So their words and their explanations, and try and see it from their own point of view. So if something really bad's happened, you might want to monitor your own reaction, because quite often our face expression gives things away. So I do it quite a lot at home, so pretend to be calm. So yeah, and just help them summarize. And there's lots and lots of language involved in breaking down these situations. So the visuals will help, and also taking it back to their level as well. So yeah, thank you. I don't know whether we do have feedback forms. I know training that I usually deliver, we'd always be collecting feedback, but Charlotte might want to advise you on that.